The wedding dress hung like a death shroud in Martha's bedroom, as she pressed the cold barrel of her father's pistol against her temple. "I'd rather die than marry that monster," she whispered to the empty room, her finger trembling on the trigger. But then she heard it. The sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats. Coming fast up the dirt road to her ranch. Martha lowered the gun and peered through the lace curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs. A lone rider was approaching, tall and dark against the setting sun, and something about the way he sat his horse made her breath catch in her throat. It couldn't be. Not after 3 years of silence. Not when she needed him most. But as the rider drew closer, Martha saw the glint of metal on his chest, a badge that caught the dying light like a promise of salvation. And when he finally looked up and pushed back his hat, revealing a face she'd loved since he was 8 years old, Martha dropped the pistol and pressed her hands to her mouth to keep from screaming. Tommy Wilson had come home, and he was wearing a United States Marshal's star. The boy she'd raised from nothing had returned as the one thing that could save her from the forced marriage that would destroy her soul. But what Martha didn't know, what would shock her to her very core, was why Tommy had really come back to Copper Falls, and what Silas Grimm had done 3 years ago that made this personal. Some secrets were worth killing for. Some debts could only be paid in blood. And some love stories began with a loaded gun and ended with justice. 3 hours earlier, Martha Hendricks had been measuring her wedding dress, preparing to sacrifice herself to save her father's ranch. Now she was about to discover that the shy orphan boy she'd protected had grown into a dangerous man with his own agenda. And Silas Grimm was about to learn that some ghosts from the past carried badges and knew exactly how to use them. But first, let me tell you how it all began. Because what happened that morning would haunt Copper Falls forever. 60 days, she whispered, reading the banker's ultimatum. 60 days to marry Silas Grimm or lose the ranch. Martha sank into the wooden chair by the kitchen window, the same chair where she taught young Tommy Wilson his letters all those years ago. Tommy had been just 8 years old when his parents died in the cholera outbreak of 1884. A skinny orphan with wild black hair and eyes that held too much sadness for a child. Most folks in Copper Falls had written him off as trouble, but Martha had seen something different. A fierce intelligence and loyalty that reminded her of her late brother. Now 17 years had passed, and Tommy had been gone for 3 of them, chasing his dream of becoming a lawman after the Pinkertons recruited him straight from their small town. His last letter had come from Denver 6 months ago, full of hope about his training and promises to visit soon, but soon had never come. And Martha had learned to swallow her disappointment along with everything else life had thrown at her. The sound of horses approaching broke through her memories. Martha peered through the lace curtains and felt her stomach clench. 3 riders were heading toward her ranch, led by the unmistakable bulk of Silas Grimm himself. At 61, Grimm owned half the businesses in Copper Falls and had been pressuring Martha to marry him ever since her father's funeral 2 months ago. His interest wasn't romantic. It was purely business. Her ranch sat on prime water rights, and Grimm wanted those rights more than he'd ever wanted a woman. Martha smoothed her faded blue dress and stepped onto the porch, squaring her shoulders despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Grimm dismounted with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted, his pale eyes scanning the property like he already owned it. "Morning, Martha," Grimm said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Beautiful day for a wedding, don't you think, Mr. Grimm?" Martha replied evenly. "I haven't given you an answer yet." Grimm's laugh was like gravel in a tin can. "Oh, but you have, darling. Your silence speaks volumes." 60 days, the banker said. "That's down to 58 now, and I'm a patient man, but not stupid." He stepped closer, and Martha caught the smell of whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. Behind him, his 2 companions, Jake Morrison and Pete Sawyer, sat their horses with the casual menace of men who made their living through intimidation. "Your daddy left you quite a mess," Grimm continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "Gambling debts, unpaid loans, taxes owed to the territory. I've done my calculations, Martha. You owe nearly $3,000. That's more money than this little ranch will see in 5 years. Martha's jaw tightened. "My father had his problems, but this ranch is profitable. I can pay the debts given time. Time's what you don't have, sweetheart." Grimm reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This here's a marriage contract. You sign it, and all your daddy's debts disappear like morning mist. You get to keep living on your precious ranch, and I get a wife in the water. Rights I need for my mining operation. And if I refuse?" Grimm's smile turned cold. "Then in 58 days you'll be homeless and penniless. Of course, I might still be willing to offer you employment at my establishment in town, I'm always looking for pretty girls to serve drinks to the miners. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a branding iron. Martha knew exactly what kind of establishment Grimm meant. The Silver Dollar Saloon, where women sold more than just drinks. She'd rather die than work there, and Grimm knew it. I need time to think, Martha said, hating the way her voice wavered. You've had 2 months to think, but I'm feeling generous today. Grimm remounted his horse and looked down at her with predatory satisfaction. I'll give you 1 more week. After that, the offer expires, and you can take your chances with the bank. As the 3 men rode away, Martha sank into the porch chair and buried her face in her hands. She'd been fighting this battle alone for so long that she'd almost forgotten what hope felt like. Tommy was gone, probably making a new life in some distant city. Her neighbors were either too poor to help or too scared of Grimm to risk his wrath. She was trapped, and everyone in Copper Falls knew it. That afternoon, Martha threw herself into the familiar routine of ranch work, hoping physical labor would quiet the panic in her mind. She was mending fence in the south pasture when she spotted a lone rider approaching from the direction of town. The sun was at his back, making it impossible to see his face, but something about the way he sat his horse triggered a memory that made her heart skip. The rider was tall and lean, wearing a dark jacket and a hat pulled low over his eyes. As he drew closer, Martha could see he was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing how to handle himself in trouble. But it was his horse that convinced her she was seeing things. A beautiful buckskin mare with distinctive white markings on her face. Buttercup? Martha whispered, recognizing the horse she'd helped birth 15 years ago. The rider dismounted 30 feet away and slowly approached, his hands visible and empty. When he finally looked up and pushed back his hat, Martha's hammer slipped from nerveless fingers. Hello, Martha, Tommy Wilson said, his voice deeper than she remembered but carrying the same warmth that had melted her heart when he was just a scared little boy. Sorry I'm late. For a moment, Martha couldn't breathe. The skinny 8-year-old with wild hair had grown into a man who stood 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders, and the kind of presence that commanded attention. His black hair was shorter now, neatly trimmed, and his jaw was covered with stubble that made him look older than his 25 years. But his eyes were the same, dark brown and filled with an intelligence that had always set him apart. Tommy, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and suddenly she could see the boy she'd raised in the curve of his mouth. Been a while since anyone called me that. Most folks call me Marshall Wilson now. Martha's eyes dropped to the E, silver star pinned to his jacket, and her knees nearly buckled. A United States Marshal. Tommy had actually done it. He'd achieved the dream he'd chased out of Copper Falls 3 years ago. Marshall Wilson, she repeated, testing the words. My God, Tommy, you really did it. I promised I would, didn't I? He stepped closer, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious concern. You look tired, Martha. Thinner than I remember. She was suddenly aware of her faded dress, her work-roughened hands, the streaks of gray in her auburn hair. It's been a difficult few years. I heard about your father. I'm sorry I couldn't make it back for the funeral. Martha nodded, not trusting her voice. Tommy had been in the middle of dangerous undercover work when her father died, according to his last letter. She'd understood, but it had still hurt to face that loss alone. I also heard about Silas Grimm, Tommy continued, his voice hardening. Is it true he's trying to force you into marriage? Martha's cheeks burned with shame. How did you? Word travels fast in a town this size. I stopped at the general store before riding out here. Mrs. Patterson was more than happy to fill me in on all the local gossip. Tommy's jaw tightened. She seemed to think it was romantic. An older gentleman, offering to rescue a spinster from financial ruin. I'm not a spinster, Martha said automatically, then felt foolish for caring about such things when her entire world was falling apart. No, Tommy said quietly. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You saved my life when I was 8 years old, Martha. You fed me, clothed me, taught me right from wrong, and loved me when I didn't think anyone ever would again. If you think I'm going to let some snake like Grimm hurt you, you don't know me as well as I thought. Martha felt tears threatening, for the first time in months. Tommy, you don't understand. My father's debts. $3,000, Tommy interrupted. I know. I also know that Grimm's been buying up distressed properties all over the territory, using intimidation and legal manipulation to force people out. He's got judges in his pocket, sheriff's deputies on his payroll, and enough money to make problems disappear. Then you know there's nothing we can do, Martha said, defeat creeping into her voice. I've fought this battle for 2 months, Tommy. I'm tired of fighting. Tommy stepped closer and gently took her hands in his. You're not fighting alone anymore. I've got money saved from my marshal's salary, enough to pay off every cent your father owed. But more importantly, I've got jurisdiction here. Grimm's been operating outside the law for years, and I intend to prove it. Martha stared at him in shock. You'd do that? Pay my father's debts? Martha, you gave me everything when I had nothing. You made me believe I could be something more than just another orphan nobody wanted. Of course I'd do that. The question is, will you let me? She wanted to say yes, wanted to throw her arms around him and sob with relief. But something held her back, a nagging awareness that the boy she'd raised had become a man she barely knew. 3 years was a long time, and people changed. What did he want in return? What would accepting his help cost her? I can't let you throw away your savings on my problems, Martha said finally. You've worked too hard. My savings, my choice. Tommy interrupted firmly. Besides, I didn't come back here just to help with your debts. Came back because Copper Falls has a problem, and that problem has a name. Silas Grimm. Martha frowned. What do you mean? Tommy glanced around to make sure they were alone, then moved closer. For the past year, I've been investigating reports of illegal land grabs throughout the Colorado Territory. Properties being seized under questionable circumstances. Families forced out by men claiming legal authority they don't actually have. Grimm's name keeps appearing in my files. You think he's been cheating people? I know he has. The question is proving it in a way that will stand up in territorial court. Tommy's eyes hardened. Grimm's been careful, always staying just inside the legal boundaries. But his treatment of you might be the mistake that finally brings him down. Martha felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. What do you need me to do? First, you're going to reject his marriage proposal publicly. Make it clear you have other options. And second, Tommy smiled, and for a moment she saw the mischievous boy who used to help her steal apples from the neighbor's orchard. Second, you're going to trust me to handle Silas Grimm. The next morning, Martha stood in front of her bedroom mirror and tried to decide what a woman wore when she was about to declare war on the most powerful man in the county. She'd chosen her best dress, dark green wool with a high collar and long sleeves, and pinned her hair back in a simple bun. She looked respectable, dignified, and not at all like a woman who had spent half the night planning strategy with a U.S. Marshal. Tommy had left before dawn, riding back to town to conduct what he called preliminary investigations. He'd promised to meet her at the bank at 10 o'clock, when Grimm would be conducting his weekly review of outstanding loans. Martha's rejection of his marriage proposal would be delivered in front of witnesses, making it impossible for Grimm to claim later that she'd been unclear about her intentions. The ride to town gave Martha too much time to think. What if Tommy's plan failed? What if Grimm had more influence than even a federal marshal could overcome? What if she was making the biggest mistake of her life by trusting a man she hadn't seen in 3 years? But as she tied her horse to the hitching post outside the Copper Falls Savings and Loan, Martha realized she'd rather go down fighting than surrender without a battle. Tommy had reminded her of something she'd forgotten during the long months of struggling alone. She was stronger than her circumstances. The bank was crowded when she walked in, exactly as Tommy had predicted. Grimm held court behind the manager's desk every Thursday morning, reviewing loan applications and foreclosure notices with the satisfaction of a king dispensing justice. He looked up when Martha entered, and his pale eyes lit up with anticipation. Martha, my dear, Grimm called. Out, loud enough for everyone in the bank to hear. Have you come to give me your answer? Martha walked slowly toward his desk, aware that every conversation in the room had stopped. Old men playing checkers by the window turned to watch. Women conducting business with the tellers craned their necks to listen. Even the bank manager, Harold Fletcher, emerged from his office to witness what everyone assumed would be Martha's capitulation. I have, Mr. Grimm, Martha said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent room. Grimm's smile widened. Excellent. I knew you'd come to your senses eventually. Fletcher, bring me the marriage contract. That won't be necessary, Martha continued, her heart hammering but her voice steady. I'm here to decline your proposal. The silence that followed was so complete that Martha could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind Fletcher's desk. Grimm's smile froze, then slowly transformed into something much less pleasant. I beg your pardon, he said quietly. I said no, Mr. Grimm. I will not marry you. Not now, not ever. I'll find another way to settle my father's debts. Grimm's face flushed red above his gray beard. Martha, you're being hysterical. You know perfectly well there is no other way. In 51 days you'll lose everything. Maybe, Martha said with more confidence than she felt. but I'd rather lose everything than sell myself to a man I don't love." The room erupted in whispers. This was better than any theater performance. The traveling companies brought to town. Grimm struggled to maintain his composure, but Martha could see the rage building behind his eyes. "You're making a mistake," Grimm said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "A very serious mistake. When you come crawling back to me in a few weeks begging for my help, don't expect the same generous terms." "I won't be crawling back, Mr. Grimm." "We'll see about that," Grimm snapped, then caught himself and forced another smile. "Of course you're entitled to your decision, however foolish it might be, but I hope you've considered what will happen to all the people who depend on your ranch for work. Old Pete, who helps with your cattle, the Martinez family, who handles your harvests. When you lose the ranch, they lose their livelihoods too." It was a low blow, and they both knew it. Martha employed 4 families part-time, and their income from her ranch helped them survive the lean winter months. Grimm was threatening not just her, but everyone who'd tried to help her. "Those people will be fine," said a familiar voice from the bank's entrance. "They'll have plenty of work." Every head in the room turned toward the door, where Tommy Wilson stood with the morning sun behind him, his marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, wearing a crisp white shirt, black vest, and polished boots. His gun belt hung low on his hips with the casual confidence of a man who knew how to use it. Martha's heart jumped at the sight of him, but it was Grimm's reaction that surprised her. The older man's face went pale, and something like fear flickered in his eyes before he mastered himself. "Marshal Wilson," Grimm said carefully. "What brings federal law enforcement to our little bank?" "Official business," Tommy replied, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "Mrs. Hendricks, I believe. You have something that belongs to me." Martha stared at him in confusion. "I'm sorry." Tommy smiled and reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded document. "The deed to the Hendricks Ranch. I purchased it this morning from the Territorial Tax Office, along with assumption of all associated debts." The room exploded in shocked murmurs. Martha felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "Tommy, what are you? The ranch is yours for as long as you want it." Tommy continued, his eyes never leaving Grimm's face. "Rent-free, of course, in exchange for your continued management of the property. All debts have been satisfied in full." Grimm shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "That's impossible. The tax office doesn't conduct business until noon." "They do for federal marshals conducting official investigations," Tommy replied smoothly. "Amazing how cooperative people become when you mention ongoing criminal conspiracies." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha watched Grimm's face cycle through shock, rage, and calculation before settling on cold fury. Whatever game Tommy was playing, Grimm was smart enough to recognize the stakes had just changed dramatically. "Well," Grimm said finally, forcing his voice to remain steady, "it appears congratulations are in order. Mrs. Hendricks has found herself a benefactor after all." He paused, his pale eyes studying Tommy with obvious suspicion. "Tell me, Marshal, what exactly does the federal government want with a small cattle ranch in Colorado?" Tommy's smile was sharp as a blade. "Justice, Mr. Grimm, same thing it always wants." As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement over the morning's drama, Martha felt Tommy's hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the door. Her mind was reeling with questions, but she had enough sense to wait until they were outside before voicing them. "Tommy, what have you done?" she whispered once they were alone on the boardwalk. "What I had to do," he replied quietly. "Grimm's more dangerous than I thought. Did you see his reaction when I mentioned criminal conspiracies? He knows exactly what I'm talking about. But the ranch, you can't just buy my ranch. Actually, I can. And I did." Tommy took her arm and guided her away from the bank's windows. "Martha, there are things about Grimm's operation that you don't know. Things that make your forced marriage look like the least of his crimes." "What kind of things?" Tommy glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Murder, for starters. 3 ranchers who refused to sell to him have died in the past 2 years. All ruled accidents or natural causes, but the timing was awfully convenient." Martha's blood ran cold. "You think he would have killed me? If you'd continued to resist, eventually, yes. Men like Grimm don't accept defeat gracefully." Tommy's jaw tightened. "But that's not going to happen because as of this morning, you're under federal protection." "Federal protection? You're now a witness in an ongoing federal investigation. That makes you my responsibility." Tommy's eyes softened. "Besides, I meant what I said yesterday. You saved my life when I was 8 years old. Did you really think I'd let anyone hurt you now?" Martha felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. "I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. You need to trust me." Tommy's expression grew serious. This isn't over, Martha. Grim won't give up just because I've temporarily blocked his plans. He'll try to find another way to get what he wants, and that makes you dangerous to him. What do? We give him enough rope to hang himself. But first, we need to have a conversation about what's been happening in Copper Falls while I've been gone. As they walked toward the hotel where Tommy had taken a room, Martha found herself studying his face in profile. The boy she'd raised had grown into a man of purpose and conviction, but she could still see traces of the lonely child who'd stolen her heart 25 years ago. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone, but as they passed the bank's window, Martha caught sight of Grim watching them from inside, his pale eyes burning with a hatred that made her shiver despite the warm morning sun. Tommy was right. This was far from over. If anything, they'd just declared war on a man who played by his own rules and had never lost a battle in his life. The question was, what was Silas Grim willing to do to win this one? That evening, Martha sat on her front porch watching Tommy brush down Buttercup in the corral, the same way he'd done when he was 12 years old, and the horse was just a yearling. Some things never changed, she thought. Even when everything else in the world seemed to be spinning out of control, Tommy had spent the afternoon asking questions about Grim's business dealings, taking notes in a leather journal he carried in his jacket pocket. Martha had told him everything she knew about the families who'd lost their properties, the mysterious accidents that had befallen Grim's enemies, the way the local sheriff seemed to look the other way whenever Grim's men got too rough with the townspeople. It's worse than I thought, Tommy had said after hearing her account. Grim's not just stealing land, he's building an empire, and empires require a certain amount of bloodshed to maintain. Now, as the sun set behind the mountains, Martha found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring. Grim wouldn't take his defeat at the bank lying down. Men like him didn't survive by accepting setbacks gracefully. He'd regroup, make new plans, and come at them from a different angle. Tommy finished with the horse and walked toward the porch, his spurs jingling softly in the evening quiet. He'd removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and Martha could see the hard muscle in his forearms from years of physical work. The boy had definitely become a man. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Just thinking about old times," Martha replied. "Remember when you were 15 and you decided you were going to catch those horse thieves single-handed?" Tommy laughed. "I remember you tanning my hide when you found out I'd been tracking them for 3 days without telling anyone. You could have been killed, but I wasn't, and I caught them, didn't I?" Martha smiled at the memory. "You were always too brave for your own good." "I learned from the best," Tommy said quietly. "You never backed down from a fight when someone needed protecting. Remember when the Jameson boys were beating up little Pete Martinez? You marched right into that saloon and dragged those grown men out by their ears. They were drunk and picking on a child. Someone had to do something. Exactly, someone had to do something." Tommy's voice grew serious. "That's what this is about, Martha. Someone has to stand up to Grim, and it might as well be me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Martha felt more at peace than she had in months, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were sitting in the eye of a hurricane, enjoying the calm, before the storm hit with full force. "Tommy," she said finally, "what happens when your investigation is over? Do you go back to Denver or wherever the Marshal Service sends you next?" The question had been weighing on her all day. Having Tommy back had reminded her how lonely her life had become. The prospect of losing him again, especially now when she'd just gotten used to not facing her problems alone, was almost unbearable. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been thinking about that myself. The Marshal Service keeps me traveling most of the time. It's not much of a life for settling down. Is that what you want? To settle down? I'm starting to think it might be." Tommy turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "I've spent 3 years chasing outlaws across half the territory, sleeping in different beds every night, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. It gets old." After a while, Martha's heart skipped. "What would you do if you weren't a marshal?" "I've been thinking about that too. I've got money saved, enough to buy a spread of my own. Maybe raise some cattle, grow some crops, live a quiet life for a change." That doesn't sound like the Tommy Wilson I remember. You always wanted adventure, excitement. Maybe what I really wanted was to prove I was worth something, that the orphan boy nobody wanted could make something of himself. Tommy paused. "I think I've proven that. Now I want something different." "What?" Tommy hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I want what you gave me when I was a kid. A home, a family, people who matter and who think you matter back." Martha felt her breath catch. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? Tommy, I know it's complicated, he said quickly. I know I'm not that 8-year-old boy anymore, and you're not just the woman who raised me. We're both adults now, and things are different between us. Martha's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Different how? Tommy stood up and walked to the porch railing, his back to her. Martha, you have to know that what I feel for you now isn't the same as what I felt when I was a child. You're not my mother or my sister or my guardian. You're a beautiful, intelligent woman who deserves to be loved the way a woman should be loved. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Martha sat frozen, her mind racing. Was Tommy saying he loved her, as a man loves a woman? The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. I don't expect you to feel the same way, Tommy continued, still not looking at her. I know the age difference, the history between us, it makes things complicated. But I had to say it. I've been carrying these feelings for 3 years, and I couldn't come back here and pretend they didn't exist. Martha stood up slowly and walked to where he stood at the railing. Tommy, look at me. He turned and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might reject him or worse, be disgusted by his confession. It was the same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd done something wrong and was waiting to see if she'd still love him. You're right, she said softly. Things are different between us now. But that doesn't mean they're wrong. Hope flared in his eyes. Martha, I've been alone for 3 years too, she continued, wondering where you were, what you were doing, whether you were safe. When I saw you riding up yesterday, the first thing I felt wasn't relief or gratitude, it was joy. Pure, selfish joy that you'd come back to me. Tommy reached out slowly and touched her face with his fingertips, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. I love you, Martha. Not the way a son loves his mother, but the way a man loves the woman he wants to spend his life with. I love you too, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Tommy pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made her knees weak. This was no gentle, respectful kiss. This was the kiss of a man claiming the woman he loved, and Martha kissed him back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Tommy rested his forehead against hers and smiled. So what happens now? Martha asked. Now we finish what we started with Grim. And then, if you'll have me, we build that quiet life I was talking about. Martha was about to respond when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn toward the road. A single rider was approaching fast, and even in the darkness Martha could see the urgency in the way he sat his horse. Tommy stepped protectively in front of her, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Expecting anyone? No, Martha replied, her earlier peace evaporating as quickly as it had come. The rider pulled up in front of the porch, and Martha recognized young Billy Patterson from town. The boy was barely 16, but his face was grim with adult worry. Marshall Wilson? Billy called out. Mr. Fletcher at the bank sent me to find you. There's been trouble. Tommy stepped forward. What kind of trouble? It's Doc Williams, sir. Someone burned down his house tonight with him and his wife inside. Martha gasped, but Tommy's expression remained steady. Are they alive? Barely, sir. Doc's got burns on his hands and arms, and Mrs. Williams breathed. A lot of smoke, but that's not the worst part. What's the worst part, son? Billy swallowed hard. Before the fire started, someone nailed a note to their front door. Mr. Fletcher said to tell you it was signed, a friend, and it said anyone who helps federal marshals investigate local business might find themselves having similar accidents. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. This was Grim's response to their victory at the bank. Not a direct attack, but a message that anyone who supported Tommy would pay the price. Tommy's jaw tightened. Thank you for bringing the message, Billy. You head on home now and tell your parents to keep their doors locked tonight. After the boy rode away, Tommy turned to Martha with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, calculating rage that reminded her that the man she loved was also a trained killer. This changes everything, he said quietly. What do you mean? I mean the gloves are off. Grim just made this personal. Martha shivered as a cold wind swept down from the mountains. The peaceful evening had been shattered, and she had the feeling that what came next would test both their love and their courage in ways they couldn't imagine. But as Tommy's arms closed around her again, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever Silas Grim had planned for them, they would face it together. The boy she'd raised had become a man worth standing beside, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone drive him away from her again. The war for Copper Falls was about to begin in Ernest and Martha Hendricks was no longer an innocent bystander. She was a woman in love with a dangerous man, and that made her dangerous too. As they walked back toward the house, Martha caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line beyond her property. Someone was watching them, and she had a pretty good idea who it was. Grimm's men were already positioning themselves for the next phase of their employer's campaign. But let them watch, Martha thought with a surge of defiance. Let them report back to their boss that Martha Hendricks was no longer the frightened woman he could intimidate into marriage. She was under the protection of a U.S. Marshal now, and more importantly, she was fighting for something worth dying. The question was, how far was Silas Grimm willing to go to get what he wanted? And more importantly, how many innocent people would suffer before this war was over? Martha had a feeling they were about to find out.